What's up, guys, and welcome to another Neo Vintage Spoilercast. I'm Jabrel, and I'm with
Steve. Hope everyone's doing well.
And for you guys who have never seen one of our Spoilercasts, basically what we like to do is break down a game that we either really enjoyed or we think is really, really interesting to talk about. And we break the podcast into segments. We like to start the top of the show with our spoiler-free thoughts. So in the event that you didn't beat the game or if you haven't played the game, you can get our general thoughts and recommendations on the game without getting any story beats spoiled. Then we go into whether we recommend it or not, our thoughts on the gameplay, thoughts on the technical performance, and then we'll end off the podcast with our thoughts on the story. So, Steve, starting with just spoiler-free thoughts about the game, what do you think?
I wished I liked it more. It's got such a good groundwork, and there's so many small, cool, and fun things in the game, and story beat wise and all like that. But they're just so far in between, and there's so little there. And what makes the bulk of the game, unfortunately, is this sort of end game, pretty much this end game section where they want you to sit there and grind and loot, and that just doesn't translate well. They obviously took cues strongly from games like Destiny, Division, and all these loot based games, and kind of just shoehorned it in. It makes no sense. It's just kind of there because they think it's going to make the game last longer. And again, sales numbers haven't exactly hit, and I'm sure the game's going to do fine. Stickiness, though, it's just not there. I was very much in the same boat. I know you mentioned this on the main podcast one time, that as soon as you were done, you were like, eject, and you were out. You were done. I think you even uninstalled it.
Yeah. And
I'm kind of in the same boat where it's like, I do not want to go back to it. And that's not a good sign, because apparently that's the bulk of what people are thinking. I try to, I stay off of people's thoughts until we usually do the spoiler cast, but a lot of people are kind of saying the same. They're like, yeah, once I beat the single player campaign, I'm pretty much done with it, and I can't blame them. I wish there was more to do. I wish the game kept me wanting to go back to it, where if I never pick this game up, and I will, obviously, due to the DLCs that are coming and / free expansions and whatever and characters, but if I never pick this game up again, I would not ever be sad. I would never lose sleep over it. So the game is, unfortunately, even though it's supposed to be a super iconic and a super content heavy game, it's lackluster and it's very mediocre. And that's pretty much my, obviously we're going to get into a deep dive of everything else, but it's a mediocre game with a fantastic license with a few shining moments. That's it for me. So what were your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I didn't love it. I think there is certainly stuff to like about this game, and depending on what type of player you are and what modes you are more interested in, then your mileage may vary on this game. But specifically for me, who was looking for a solid story and fun gameplay, there wasn't too much for me here. It's on the shorter end in terms of that. So this being a kind of $60 experience for that amount of story is just not really adequate in my book. The biggest critique I could ever offer about this game, spoiler free, is that this game just wasn't ready all across the board. I could see this becoming a pretty great game down the line once they introduce a whole bunch of new characters, new story threads for them. The game becomes more stable and more technically proficient. Maybe they extend the story a little bit. They have more online modes and different stuff you can play around with it, more DLC gear and stuff like that. I could see in a year or so this game becoming something really, really great. And I mean, who knows? Theoretically, we could have the Destiny of superhero games here. But at least for right now, I think there's just too much missing here. It's too unstable. There's too many issues with this for me in good faith to call it a great game, because I just really don't think it is. Now, again, if the price proposition was different and this was a $30 experience, maybe my opinion would be different. But the fact that they released this as a kind of AAA $60 experience, and then you go and you jump in there and you get this level of quality after that amount of development time is a little bit confusing to me. That this kind of release in the state it did. So I guess I could just ask you straight up, as it is right now, do you recommend it?
I can't recommend it unless unless I guess you had 3 other friends who were all really dying to get into it and was going to spend time with you playing, the after part of the game, because That's, again, the campaign is very short. You're talking 8 to 10 hours, pretty much max. And unless you have three other friends who was like, we can play every night and constantly, you're not gonna get your money's worth at this moment. Like you're saying, in a couple months, weeks, when some DLC starts coming out and more patches come out, and hopefully some more like better gear and events, then you may be able to do it. But even then, at $60, when other games have pretty much, Destiny went free to play and stuff like that, and I understand that Destiny was $60 at launch. But, Marvel's never going to go free to play. So that $60 is very steep, especially for the fact that it doesn't run too well. I just can't recommend this game in its current state at this time.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much same here. I won't recommend it right now in good faith. If you can get it for cheaper, then I think maybe it's worth looking into. If you can get it in the future for cheaper, once it's more stable and patched and stuff like that, I think there's certainly you can get some fun out of it. Who knows, once the next gen consoles are out and this game drops to maybe like $20-$30 or something like that, you can get some fun out of it for sure. But as it is right now, no, I definitely do not recommend it. And I think there's a hell of a lot of different games that you can jump into and get way more of your money's worth right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's just, especially in economic times right now where people are very, tight on their money and want the most out of their games, you're not going to get that in Marvel's Avengers, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I guess we can jump into the spoiler section here right now. So heads up to anyone who doesn't want any spoilers for this game. You could leave now. There's your recommendation, which is not a recommendation. We're going to jump into our thoughts on gameplay now. Now, this is not the technical performance. This is just how it feels to play. So, Steve, did you like the way it felt to play?
So it came and went. So it almost really felt on depending on which character. So I think you're given, I can't remember exactly, I think you're given Hulk to play as first, and it felt good to be Hulk because you're just this tank and you're busting through all these robots and everything's cool. But then it's like the small dumb things that's like, why would Hulk get so staggered by a quick punch by a robot and the combos kind of break for him. So I would have been okay playing a little less Hulk if you made me feel like the Hulk, and I hate using that term, but if you would have made me feel like you're actually this big, almost invulnerable Titan. But then when you're playing other characters, I absolutely loved, and this is I was super surprised. I really didn't think I would like Kamala or Miss Marvel. I did not think I was going to really enjoy her, but most of the times when I had a mission and I had the option to play as her, I would, because she felt great. Her abilities were a little bit more unique with the stretching ability and stuff like that. So the platforming was a little bit cooler because it was a little bit more forgiving. And same with Captain America. I felt he was pretty spot on. I mean, there's a section when you're running it's not, I guess it's a spoiler, but in a spaceship. And he just felt cool. It felt cool to wall run as him. Playing with him with the shield and stuff was really good. I thought I would enjoy Black Widow more, and I did initially, until I got to Cap, actually. But there's something about her just doesn't feel right. She's jumping all over the screen, but, as we know, she isn't a super-powered human. So for her to be able to jump the way she jumps and all these stuff, not relying more on her tech and, I guess, stealth mechanics, is really weird. And unfortunately, I didn't spend too much time as Thor.
Okay.
I just because he's, like, MIA for the most of the part, and then when I got to him, I didn't really want to play as him that much, especially because his stuff is, I don't want to say generic, but we've played a lot of other heavy hitting characters. Like the biggest thing people compare him to is like Kratos, and though Kratos fights way tighter and obviously doesn't fly the way Thor does, it was fun the few times I did play as him. Iron Man was the one I actually liked the least to play as, though. So
good. I'm glad I'm not the only one.
All right, yeah. So I mean, Iron Man's a huge problem with. I have a huge problem with Iron Man this whole game, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But it's so weird, where it's like people are like, "Oh, what's the gameplay like?" I'm like, it depends which Avenger you get, and you really can't choose who you want to play as until way later. And by the time you can finally do that, the game's over. And I think that's huge. This game has huge pacing issues.
Oh yeah.
So, on the main, gameplay, which is just kind of this brawler, it really depends. Like, sometimes you're gonna have fun with it. Sometimes these characters are too clunky and dumb to play as. So it's like my thoughts on the gameplay are just so mixed. Where it's like it shouldn't be this scaled. Where it's like I absolutely hated some characters and loved others. So what on a basic, what was your thoughts on the gameplay?
Yeah, generally speaking, I didn't have any major gripes with the characters. When I was playing the beta, it was definitely Cap was the one that I really resonated with. But getting the chance to spend time with everybody, and especially on the latter half, I really like. Once I started upgrading like Kamala and the different moves and stuff like that, she is capable of some like crazy stuff. And she is one of the more ranged characters in terms of her abilities, in terms of dealing out damage and mobility and stuff like that. The interesting thing is I actually played a good chunk of the latter half of the game using Thor, so I'm pretty equipped to talk about that. He's very interesting because again he has that kind of hard hitting edge to him that would put him. It's like there's like parts of him that sometimes it's like playing like Iron Man. He has a little bit of Hulk in there, but at the same time he's like got this crazy mobility and stuff like that. So he's a very interesting character to play with. Flying to me doesn't feel particularly great using anyone. Black Widow, I do like the being able to use the guns fairly freely. It gives you like real good range. The only problem is I feel like sometimes they'd line you up with enemies to use as Black Widow that are like I didn't feel equipped to deal with. So they have those crazy like biomechanical soldiers that they edited.
Yeah.
And I'm fighting them as Black Widow. And I mean, they're kind of rambunctious. And I'm like, I wish I had literally anyone else to use right now because for a second they're like beating my head in. And I'm like, her abilities are pretty cool and everything like that. But I'm like, man, I wish I had somebody else to use right now. Because again, some of the moments when you're like running through the hallways and using her little, I don't know, like a hook shot thing to move around and stuff like that. She's fast, so that's kind of fun. But generally speaking, I wouldn't say that like any of them I absolutely loved using, but I definitely say that like Kamala Khan warmed up to me a lot more. Hulk is fun because I like that one triangle move where you kind of dig into the ground and lift it up again, and you can kind of just spam that all around you and keep everybody at a distance, so that's fun.
You kind of have to. You kind of have to spam that move.
Yeah, because eventually they throw so much at you that you kind of have to. I mean, at least for me, I did this blend of using the triangle move and then jumping and slamming, and just getting that in kind of a rotation would keep people off me because once they swarm you, forget about it.
Yeah, you're gonna get overwhelmed in this game no matter who you're playing as, and most of the time it's not lack of ability. It's more just the game's designing it that way, and that's a little bit more on the technical performance, but you're gonna get outnumbered quickly.
And I guess my one major critique with the gameplay is the fact that it has a very quantity over quality kind of approach to specifically enemies and enemy placement, especially in the latter half of the game, where it's not like they cleverly designed certain enemies that you have to think on the fly of like how you're going to approach it, and it's more so they just throw more of them at you. And so it's more like maintaining distance and not getting, trapped in a corner or anything like that. But I did find myself on the latter half of the game kind of getting more exhausted than anything, where like I'd walk into a room and there's just like 10 dudes running at me and I'm like, oh, okay, fine. Like, do we really have to do more of this? Like, it felt like that one section in the first Avengers movie where they look at the enemies swarming through the hole and they're just like, oh, God. Yeah. And that's kind of like me all the time playing Avengers, where it's just like more and more and more and more. And then there's a giant robot comes out of the ground and I'm like, oh, God, give me a break. I never felt more thankful than when Ant-Man came and shrunk that one machine.
Oh, my goodness. After you've had to fight
I was about to cry. I was like,
spider,
I can't do this
again. The spider
again.
thing, right? Or
yeah. I was like, I can't do that again. That was too much.
Because it took forever, and then immediately another one showed up, and I was like, ugh. I was like, no.
I was like,
Thank God for Ant-Man to come through.
But yeah, generally, I would say the gameplay's fine. Again, as I was playing it, I always wanted to feel more like God of War, more like Spider-Man, more like Arkham, and less like Ultimate Alliance. That's kind of like my main comparison. Is that things don't necessarily have the grounded impact that I'd hope for, and you can get closer to it when you use people like Thor and Hulk, but none of it really help. Like for example, small touches like when you hit an enemy and certain parts of them fall off, and you could see the degradation is not really there. It's just kind of generic arcadey impact. And again, just on a game of this caliber, I was just hoping for a little bit more, hoping to have like cool combo moves where you're Hulk and you rip their arms off and hit them with their own arms, or small things like that. that I felt like that if, and again, I mean this with the utmost respect, if this wasn't like Crystal Dynamics, if this was like a Sony first party game, you would have seen stuff like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's just one thing. It's just I feel like it can be a little bit bare bones kind of across the board.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that even comes down to enemy design. So, again, I never really watched too many like gameplay breakdowns of this game and stuff like that. I waited more for the beta. But be prepared to fight a bunch of glowing purple silver robots. Even though you get different quote-unquote enemies, they come down to shiny silver robots and a couple humans with like flamethrower jetpacks and stuff like that.
Yeah, you'll be thankful to see the human ones, I'll tell you.
Yeah, they're very far in between. And I get it in this story, and I get it you can't just have a bunch of thugs because you're playing the Avengers so late in their time, so they're obviously well versed. But I don't know what I wanted, but I did not want to fight robot after robot, and that's like, oh, here's this new enemy. He's just a tall NPC with no design, and he glows different colors sometimes. And it's just like, who was in charge of this, that every enemy is like the same? And it's like, it's just after 10 hours, roughly, I was so tired of just fighting robot after robot. And every once in a while, you'll get frozen, and I gotta hit square. And I'm like, really? The Hulk got frozen? The Hulk got frozen. I'm like, alright. And it's so tedious, unfortunately. Sometimes that gameplay gets so tedious, and that's my really only main issue with it, was that problem.
And again, not to sound too negative, because there is one benefit is I do want to commend them a little bit. There is some awesome action choreography, for example, of like early on when you're Kamala Khan and you're getting chased, for example, Cap on the space station. There's like different parts where there's some really, really awesome action choreography. Obviously, the bridge collapse, that was also in the beta and stuff like that. Yeah, it was pretty cool. So there are small moments where they choreograph some cool kind of light platforming sections that I think are actually really, really fun. Sometimes, every once in a while, I'd like fall and I'm like, oh god. But generally speaking, or like when you're like stretching as Kamala for the first time, climbing up that mountain to get into Tony's base and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Again, there's like small sections that I'm like, oh, this is really cool. I enjoyed this, and this is kind of where like the Tomb Raider legacy kind of comes in, where you start seeing that connection a little bit more. But yes, generally speaking, I think there's a lot to dislike about the gameplay. There's some stuff to like about a gameplay, and that's kind of like this summarizing this whole thing in general, is that there's good things, there's bad things, and depending on what you prioritize as a player will depend on whether this is the game for you or not.
Yeah, again, it's unfortunate. It's just those sections like that we were saying, Cap in the space station, Kamala running through the city, and they're so great, but again, there's just, it's not always there. There's not really a moment like that for Thor. There is for Tony, kind of, when you find him in his mansion and you're kind of running through like the house, and you're grabbing one piece of your armor at a time. I'm like, oh, this is kind of dope. He ends up looking ridiculous, but it kind of made sense in the story wise. So it's like those moments I had the most fun, and then you would get bogged down with some other things that's like not as uplifting and stable.
Now, if you guys thought we were being too negative, now we're going to move on to our thoughts on technical performance. And this is where, obviously, for you guys who have been paying attention, a bulk of the criticism for Avengers comes from. Obviously, some people didn't love the story. Some people love the story. Some people like the character design. Some people don't like the character design. And that's one thing I do want to commend them before we move on, is I do like some of the new character designs, especially on that latter half of the Iron Man retrofitted Avengers suits. Those are cool. But yeah, the technical performance is a hot mess. And obviously Square is very aware of this because they had the detailed patch notes that we talked about on the last podcast. Steve, what was your experience technically with this game, even though we kind of know the answer already?
Yeah, so I think this is good because you played on a base PS4. I did play on a PS4 Pro. And most of these problems still go to PCs and stuff like that, but so we can at least see the scaling. So on a PS4 Pro, I could not believe how bad this game was running. And it's not that I'm like, oh, PS4 Pro should play everything perfect, because it's really coming down to the game. Because, I mean, you've had a base PS4 this whole generation, and it's very rare that you ever told me like how bad some of this stuff has been.
No, the things run for the most part.
Yeah, Spider-Man ran fine for you, from my understanding. I don't remember you having any issue with that.
No, not at all.
So this game technically, my goodness, and it goes from my problem is that it's beyond just like some slowdowns and some cutscenes and some pop-ins. It's very drastic, and I said this on the podcast. Every other scene at the beginning of the game, my Bruce Banner would grow and lose his beard, and I thought I was tripping. I was like, but at the one point, my wife next to me is like, "Didn't he just have a beard? What happened?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't know. He's clean shaved." And then the next scene, he would have a beard, and I'm like, "Wait, what's going on?" And I'm like, "Am I missing flashbacks? Why does he lose his beard?" And I'm like, I had to load up there's that scene with Kamala very early and Bruce Banner where they're in the minivan, whatever, and she's like slurping on a slushy, super annoying.
Yeah.
And so I played that scene twice. I don't know, I guess my save just didn't do it. And the first time I have it recorded, he's got a beard. The second time he just doesn't have a beard. And you can tell it's supposed to be there because it's weird and botchy, but it's not there. All those kind of graphical issues aside, the game just slows down. In a game where that's trying to just overwhelm you with enemies, you're going to get the craziest chugs I think I've seen this generation. With just complete slowdowns, complete just chunkiness where it looks like frames are just missing and it's jumping from one section to the other. From, again, I didn't have like super game-breaking bugs that are out there. There's people who just, the mission will not load, the mission will never load, they had to completely restart the game. I didn't have that bad of a game-breaking bug. I did have things where I would have to reload 3 or 4 times because the elevator wouldn't go up and down, or the prompt would be there and I would hold it, the little circle would fill up, and nothing would happen, and I would run out of time, and then the mission would be like, you failed. The load times they don't seem that bad until that, like the smallest thing, especially when you were Kamala running through the city, which was really the only stealth section, I believe, which is unfortunate. When you would get caught, it would take minutes for you to restart just a few blocks at a checkpoint a few blocks before.
Oh yeah, that was annoying. And
it's like, well, and that's early on where I'm like, I'm still trying to figure out how to move as Kamala and how well is, the stealth mechanics, because they're kind of just thrown in there. I had to watch, those cutscenes, if I never have to see, the Hulk screaming and watching his neck jiggle in HD, I will never complain if I never have to see that again. And it's so weird. It's just unfortunate that this is not where Crystal Dynamics should be, because I've seen their last 3 games obviously were the 3 Tomb Raiders. I'm sure they've worked on other things, but those 3 Tomb Raider games, I've dabbled in the second and the third one a little bit. I completed the first one completely, and I never had an issue that way.
No, those were really solid games. Yeah,
they were really solid. They were really good looking, and so I don't know if it's just we held them to a different standard, and this is obviously a far departure from what they're used to. This is why they had so many people on this game, because you had everyone from Crystal Dynamics and all their sister branches helping, and I don't know if it's just there's too many people together or too many people working on separate sections. Then when you try to put it together, it fell apart. The engine, I'm not sure what it is, but it just technically was a game that felt like it I don't know, I had moments where it just reminded me, there's this old Marvel game Activision published, Marvel Rise of Imperfects or something like that, or
fighter,
Marvel Nemesis or something. I don't remember exactly what it's called.
I think it was Marvel Nemesis Rise of the Imperfects.
Yeah, what a title. Wow. So yeah, it had parts where it's like, why does it feel so clunky? And it's like, that game is super old. This game is a 2020 game that you guys announced, I think this game was announced in 2017. We saw nothing till 2019, and you released it a year later. So that's a big bulk of time for the game to be running this way, and this is not like little glitches that weren't found in QA. You had to know this game was running bad. Some of this feedback was given in the, and I hate using the term beta because they called it a beta, which was basically a demo, because the demo was 2 weeks before launch. You weren't going to fix all those problems. I just don't get how and who really pushed and forced this game to be released in this state, and it's terrible. So what was some of your thoughts technically for this game?
Yeah, it's weird because obviously the experiences a lot of people are having are very varied. Some people make it all the way through with limited, problems. Some people are bumping into game-breaking bugs that are like deleting saves and bricking PS4. I've seen like some crazy stuff from this game. And then mine were kind of, yeah, I bumped into a lot of the normal stuff. So I had to reload the game, I believe, on 3 separate occasions, and mostly from endless load screens. That was kind of the thing. At one point, I did bump into the issue over and over again where I'd be running as a character or as a team, and I'd go to an area that's supposed to trigger a cutscene, but there's always like a couple seconds of lag time where the screen or the world goes black, and I could see like 1 or 2 assets on the screen, and then it launches. Mm-hmm. So that would always happen. So there was obviously some kind of disconnect between the cinematic triggers and the world itself. I fell through the world a couple times. There's like kind of very routine kind of game breaking stuff that I bumped into, but thankfully it was generally something I could make it through. You saw that I beat the game before you did, and that was certainly in part of just me not bumping into as many issues as other people, but just the moment to moment performance was pretty atrocious. I mean, I would actually notice the amount of times it didn't slow down. Like that's how bad it was, at least on my PS4, is that almost every exchange chugged down to, and again, I'm not a frame rate guy, but I could tell it was probably closer to like 15 frames per second when the screen was populated. So, I mean, it was pretty crazy how much it was dropping and freezing and audio clipping. And yeah, I would hear sometimes there would be audio glitches where somebody would keep saying the same phrase over and over again. I'm like, please, for the love of God, stop. Like I would just hear Kamala in the background saying something like, "Oh, we need to go do this," and I'm like, "All right, heading that. We need to go do this." And I'm like, "I swear I'll kill you. You say it again." So that was driving me nuts. But yeah, it's very interesting how it's so varied. Again, like some people, and it doesn't seem to be consistent even across devices too. Because I've seen some stuff on Twitter specifically of being like, "Hey, I'm running this on a Pro, and this is like barely running for me. The load screens are like 30 seconds long." And then I've seen some people say, "Hey, I'm on a base PS4. I've made it through front to back kind of fine." Doesn't mean that any experience is more or less valid than the other, but it's very interesting how like everybody's experiences are kind of different. How much of the online mode have you played? Is the technical performance bad on there as well?
So I tried it obviously because I wanted to see what was up with it, and the finding a match I feel like just takes, or not a match I guess, because you have to wait for the party to load up, and it just took forever. I sat there one time for almost 15-20 minutes, and like one guy joined in, and then he popped, then he would leave, and then I only ever got to actually launch a mission once, and it just was kind of more of the same. I have my PS4 hooked up wired for that because I tried doing it Wi-Fi and it was terrible. So I put it, hardwired it in, and it was okay. It just ran a little bit worse than like the main campaign. Just technically, obviously, it just wouldn't hold up as well. It also looked blurry. Like it looked like there was, I don't know, like Vaseline over the whole screen where it was just kind of foggy. And I don't know if it was just that connection, that match, or what it was. All I know is I did not want to do that ever again. So I have not jumped back into the online portion, whatever they call it, the Avengers Initiative.
Yeah, so we'll probably be the ones to speak the most definitively on the story mode, and I'm sure you could find people online who maybe dived into the Avengers Initiative stuff that can give you more detailed thoughts on that regard. So I guess we can jump on to the final part, which is probably where we'll have a lot to say too as well, which is the thoughts on the story. Now, this is a very unconventional Avengers story because, again, it's kind of like you're catching the Avengers after their heyday and kind of trying to bring them back together and reconstruct, and you're kind of living in a post-Avengers world with a resistance and everything. So it's a very unconventional Avengers approach. And also, I would like to make the note for any of you who haven't noticed, calling this an Avengers game, at least for half the story, is a little of... I wouldn't say it's a lie, but it's misleading because this is very much a Kamala Khan Miss Marvel game, 100%.
Yep.
And it's kind of like Kamala Khan and Friends. Now, towards the latter half, when you're really fighting against the main antagonist of this, yeah, it's very much an Avengers game. You can choose who you want. Everybody's there together. Everybody's in their suits. Beautiful. But a good chunk of the game, you're kind of playing around with the interpersonal relationships of Kamala Khan in relation to the rest of the Avengers and them kind of coming through the various traumas and issues associated to what is known as A-Day. So generally speaking, I would say I enjoyed the story. It is by no means the best Avengers story I've ever experienced. That's more probably like Infinity Gauntlet or something like that. But generally speaking, I think it's pretty fun. I think the choice of Avengers is a little peculiar, but I'm not necessarily mad at it because it has a very traditional approach. But then there are like some people that they didn't utilize in there, so I'm not mad at it. I like Kamala Khan. I like her character, generally speaking. The story's fine. One of the things that I probably like the most about this game is just really getting to see the full development of MODOK from front to back was probably the most interesting thing. Is this in many ways is the first, I feel like, detailed high fidelity way I've ever seen his origin story kind of played out, at least in this iteration. So I thought that was really, really fun, and kind of seeing this guy slowly lose it and get his powers and kind of have his motivations to kind of replace the Avengers, which in some ways, if you look at it, was like partially justified and stuff like that. And you know me more than anybody, I love when they play around with like morality and justification of actions and stuff like that. And so it's like, it's just a very interesting approach to have that specifically antagonist. Now, obviously, on the latter half of the game, things get a little bit more campy, a little bit more superhero, especially when they bring in the Sentinel and stuff like that. So, generally speaking, I like the story. Don't love it. I wish they were a little bit more forthcoming on the fact that this is very much a Kamala Khan story, unless that this is an Avengers story with a new hero attached to it, because that's really not the case at all. What were your thoughts on the story?
So yeah, I went in, it's a mixed bag. So when you start off with Kamala Khan very young, celebrating A Day. So I'm like, all right, it's very weird because like, I was like, okay, they're setting the stage to be very, very cheesy in certain ways and very campy, and I'm okay with that as long as you let me know ahead of time that I'm not going to a Christopher Nolan universe and stuff like that. So super okay with that. Super okay with everyone really holding up these superheroes to a status. Obviously this is not a comic book podcast, but Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, is something that Marvel's really been pushing since her premiere. And recently, they're starting to push her. If you're into the comics at all, she's getting her own series on Disney Plus. Maybe, who knows how that all ends up working. So I was early on when I saw that they were really gonna push Kamala Khan. I was like, okay, I'm okay with that. Even though this is called an Avengers game, but those first hours, this is literally just Bruce Banner and Kamala's adventures in the desert, and that sounds bad. Thankfully, I mean, their performances and their relationship works so well. Troy Baker and the voice actress, I'm sorry, I can't remember the voice actress who does Kamala, did absolutely great together. They worked very well together. And that doesn't translate to every character, unfortunately, and performances vary, but the story-wise, it was really well done. I was always curious when I heard early on that they were going to do MODOK as the main antagonist. I'm like, how are you going to do that? Because, he is... I mean, we've seen different versions of him, but basically he's a giant head in a frame. I don't know. So it's very weird. It's like, how are we going to see this done? And you see him very early as a normal human, and you see the understanding of why his head gets so big and why he gets his psychic abilities. And it made sense. I'm like, wow, it's on the verge where it's like, this almost would have made sense in the MCU. Obviously separate thing, but that's as realistic as I think you could do it in the MCU, because it's just so weird to say someone becomes a giant head. And so I was okay with it, and I was rolling with it, and the morality thing is really well done because it gave you vibes of Ultron, who is, at least in the MCU movies, he was created to be kind of the new Guardian to replace the Avengers, and it's kind of what MODOK wants to do. He's like, listen, I want everyone to be human, and I want to get rid of the Inhumans that were caused by the A-Day incident. And it's like, is he really doing something terrible? Obviously, it goes along with what's that woman's name who's with him? She's supposed to be like
I forget.
The second antagonist. Not Maria Hill. That's S.H.I.E.L.D.
Yeah.
Let me see, bring up her name very quickly. She's this other character who's pretty much his right-hand man, and she is kind of lackluster in my opinion. Monica.
Yes, Monica.
So Monica Rappaccini, I don't know how to pronounce. I think her character was very weak in the latter half because at first she's obviously the one who's kind of orchestrating and helping, MODOK, and he quickly realizes that she's, been infusing him with Captain America's DNA and blood and all these other inhuman things, which is what causes him to get his abilities, and he can control all these other enemies, and most of the enemies you end up fighting are, controlled by him. Her character, I was very, okay, because I knew, I'm like, let's just get to MODOK, let's just get to him. She was very, her repertoire with Black Widow was okay, story-wise, seeing their kind of back and forth was fine, but it was just so tropey where it's something we've seen constantly, and that's my main complaint about the story. Is some of this stuff is things we've seen constantly already. We've seen Iron Man not get along with Thor, and Iron Man not get along with Captain America in the comics and other video games, and obviously in the MCU we've seen these clashes before, so we don't really see too much there. And then the things that we kind of do want to see, when Iron Man and Hulk obviously have that battle, you don't get to see the battle. They break out a window and that's it. So we do see a little bit. You see the Hulk Buster and all that kind of stuff, but it's not where I wanted it to be. So unfortunately, I think the story was safe.
Yeah.
And I think, especially at the ending, obviously they're hinting, obviously with the Kree Sentinel that's shown off at the end as the final enemy. And he shoots a laser, I guess. So obviously we know what they are kind of hoping for, either in a DLC or in an event, or a full-fledged sequel with the Kree coming. I think that story sounds like it'd be really cool with an Earth invasion. Who knows? I just think this was almost too safe, except for the fact that MODOK was a really good antagonist, and that sometimes these games don't get their villains right. And I think this time, luckily and surprisingly, they really knocked MODOK out of the park for me. So story-wise, again, even though it was safe, it was good and good enough also to get me through the campaign.
Yeah, and I also wanted to note that I looked it up. The Kamala Khan voice actress, her name is Sandra Saad. So.
Sandra, I knew it was something. So she did fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah, Troy Baker, I mean, he murdered this role. Man, he did good.
Yeah, everyone always likes to give a lot of crap towards, because the three people that are they always say they're in everything: Laura Bailey, Nolan North, and Troy Baker.
Yes,
obviously they are in everything, but they also are some of the best.
Yeah,
I think specifically Troy Baker stood out in this role where I haven't seen him really stand out in a role, obviously, since Joel.
Yeah.
So I think he really encapsulated that really well. Nolan North as Iron Man, this is something I've been saying for a while, even pre-beta and stuff like that. Just something doesn't work with me. There's a few scenes where it was okay, and Laura Bailey, I just feel like I don't know. I like her role in other games a lot, and I'm a big fan of all of these three, these three icons. But I just feel like she was just herself in this one, where she didn't have a personality. She didn't put on an attitude of Black Widow.
Yeah, and I think a lot of whenever you want to depict Tony in any capacity or Iron Man, you're fighting a uphill battle now because of Robert Downey Jr.'s amazing performance, where in many ways he's become that character. So now, to any point when you want to depict that character, you're immediately in competition with Robert Downey Jr., and if it doesn't have even a portion of the same charisma, it's going to feel off because, again, it's been, 11 years of him depicting that character, so we've come very accustomed. And, again, before him, there was nobody who really played him. There was some voice actors that depicted him in the Iron Man cartoon, but other than that, it was a comic entity. And then the first time we saw him really depicted in something bigger budget, it was the Iron Man movie. So that's also kind of working against Nolan North, is the fact that, again, it's big shoes to fill. You know what I mean? So
yeah, he's no Robert Downey Jr. And again, that's why I try to be more forgiving. And there were scenes that he was good when you first see him with Hulk, and when he's cooking the hot dogs and stuff like that. And he wants to punch him and stuff like that. Those scenes worked for me. I don't know if maybe underneath I'm low key it's not Robert Downey Jr. It doesn't look like Robert Downey Jr. Even though it's just that line's been blurred so much that comics now make their Iron Man look and act like Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man. So it's mixed like that. And it grew on me the more I was with this Tony. Obviously, I think they specifically did never put him in like a suit or in a button-up T-shirt. He's in a plain white tee for a long time, and I think they did that purposely to try to break that mold.
Yeah, I guess the main thing I would have to say about the story is I liked it. I just wish they took a couple more risks. When you're adapting a property and there's some aspects of it that look a little tad generic and stuff like that, things can get boring. And the one thing that kind of changed the way I look at superhero depictions in games and stuff like that is specifically Telltale's Batman. And I know that sounds off, but what I'm saying is when they depicted Batman, which has been done to death at this point, they made so many weird choices and left turns that it really kept you engaged in a property that otherwise you thought, like, okay, it's more of the same. But they did something so different and off the wall that some people, hey, you could even say that they took too many risks, but you got to commend them. They tried to do something different. And that, I guess, is one of my main issues with Avengers, is coming off of, 11, 15 years of the MCU at this point, of building the Avengers. When they're going to do a game that's not connected to the MCU, I expect them to do a story that is fundamentally different in tone and vibe and just a completely different iteration to kind of, stand there and be like, hey, we're doing something completely different. Don't connect us to that. I know some of the visuals can kind of evoke the same imagery, but tone-wise, it's a completely different thing. And it didn't really come off as a different tone. It just kind of felt like, in many ways, their attempt to do the MCU with a little bit of a different backdrop, a different point in the timeline, but less so a different universe in its entirety. You know what I mean?
No, absolutely, yeah. Where it's like they wanted to. I completely agree. Where they didn't make it different enough. Where that's why early on people hated the looks of all the characters, and I'm like, you don't hate it. You just think. You're thinking of Chris Evans and all these people, and you're not always gonna get that. And it's weird because they made certain. Then they did make some changes where some of these characters look too much like that. I think Thor looks too much like Hemsworth, not different enough. And if you see early promotion artwork, Thor was gonna be bald and with a beard, and really interesting to see that. Especially if you look at Crystal Dynamics sent like the care packages to big influencers. And on that, there's a picture of Thor with like a scar, and he's bald. And it's like, see, in that aspect, you're going with a way different Thor.
Yeah.
Why did you go the safe Chris Hemsworth looking one? And that's why I'm glad, like, though Iron Man or Tony Stark doesn't look exactly like Robert Downey Jr. I'm glad he doesn't. And for the rest of the characters, I'm glad they don't look like their counterparts in the MCU, because then that line would have been even thinner, and then we would have even more problems.
Yeah, and I just feel like if you're going to make bold choices, one thing, commit and really go for it. So, for example, if you're going to quote-unquote kill Cap for a little bit, keep him dead. And I know it's not going to be the most enjoyable thing for the Cap fans, but yeah, keep him dead. Try something new. Or how about, you unite the Avengers and everything's fine, but towards the end, you have a conversation with Bruce, and he's like, listen, I don't really have any intention of being the superhero thing again. This is your era. And then it kind of sets the stage for a new Avengers, or the Champions, for example, in the MCU, or in the comics. I think that would be really, really interesting to set it up for, if you're going to do a post-Avengers world, double down, stick to it. Do the post-Avengers world. In the world where, if you want Kamala Khan to be that girl, make her that girl. But they kind of made her go through all this progression to ultimately kind of just fall back onto her place on the cover of the game, which is, just part of the Avengers. Everything's happy again. Yeah, I know we kind of screwed up and, killed off half the freaking city, and it took us forever because we're sulking and sad. But we got us all back together, and everything's fine and dandy now, and we're back on the airship, and S.H.I.E.L.D. is back together, and everything's beautiful. Where I feel like they set up this world that was really grave and messed up, and everything, they failed straight up. And I felt like it would have been really, really cooler if they're going to rebuild something, don't rebuild it into exactly what it was before. Rebuild it into something fundamentally different. So new heroes, new vibe entirety, new, and kind of like a new motivation, because stuff like if they had a thing where A-Day can never happen again, for example, what I think would be really, really interesting. But again, they kind of ended in the same place they started, and I just hate when I feel like a story didn't do its due diligence to make progress. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it didn't upscale. It just kind of went full circle, where it's like, if you're gonna, the Avengers in general, just in all media, is very well known. So going even a little bit more, I was always curious. I'm like, why is it just Kamala who's the new Avenger? Especially when you go to the Anthill, I'm like, oh, we're gonna see somebody who maybe will become one, later on, or even in this game, be part of the new Avengers, because that'd be cool. That's something we haven't seen a lot. People like to go the safe route of Iron Man, Hulk, and the rest of the cast. And in this game, it starts to tease you, because especially with Bruce Banner, who's like, I don't want to be the Hulk. I'm okay with being the guy behind the screen and doing this stuff. I'm okay with that. I got to Hulk out when I got to Hulk out, obviously, but and they start teasing with him really bringing Kamala Khan in, and Black Widow and all these people really taking her under the wing. I'm like, why is it just her? Because there's a whole bunch of Inhumans, and was it, again, I don't know what the licensing issue is, but it's like you didn't bring any of these newer heroes and the diversity of the heroes, because I'm like, you have the diversity in Kamala. I'm like, what about the rest of the cast, the rest of the people out there that you could have brought in? And I understand like Black Panther's coming as DLC. He could have been reined in way more already in the space story. You could have expanded the story that way, having let's say to go to Wakanda and stuff like that. It just would have made more sense that way. You didn't upscale anything. You kind of just stayed the same, which is unfortunate.
You know who they could have easily introduced in the Anthill, and why I don't understand why they weren't there? Jane Foster. She would have been perfect there. Where it's like, what if in the event that Thor's like, no, I'm done. I didn't like it. I'm sad. The Cap's dead. I'm not coming back. And Jane's like, all right, I'll handle it. Like, I think that would be really, really cool, too, if they just had different iterations of the Avengers. So, like, the game begins with this thing, but then actually, if you're going to pull the 180 and be like, hey, this is actually not the Avengers game that you thought you were going to get, and Kamala's the main character, all right, then double down on that and craft a new Avengers. But they didn't really want to do that so much as they wanted her to be the glue by which to bring everybody back together, which I think is a cute and endearing story, but I like risks, and I value risks, and I would rather them try to do something new and fail in that regard than do something safe and make something mediocre. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And, it's hard because we have to start, this game's always going to be compared, in the next 2 years, we're getting 2 big DC games, and it's going to be bouncing back. And it looks like those games are taking a little bit more risk. So we have Gotham Knights, which is straight up killing off Batman.
Yeah.
And it's like, here's a Batman game with no Batman. Oh, I was like, yes, good stuff.
Bold.
Which is, yeah, perfect. And then you have Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, who you don't have just all the normal. They could have went and just gave you Joker, Harley, and I don't know, some other villains like Bane and stuff like that to do that, but they're giving you, Captain Boomerang and like these weird guys. They could have played it safe and just made a Justice League game and been like, here's Batman, here's Wonder Woman, they play similar. You're getting these weird characters who have their own identity, and it's like some of I wish there was a little bit of that flavor in the Avengers.
Yeah, it's like, we got conventional Avengers, so do something different.
Yeah.
And I don't mind too much if people are like, that was weird, I don't know if I like that. I'll take that any day before, like, hey, just another conventional Avengers, same people, same Tony, Thor, Bruce, like, yep, the same lineup, Black Widow, too, because I guess she's a big thing now, too, since the MCU. Like, I don't know, I wish they took more risks, and hey, at least I know it's probably going to re-up on a lot of its costs. It's probably going to sell really well, which means we can get a sequel. And then hopefully maybe that's a fundamentally different experience. And maybe they can really fix a lot of the critiques. It could perform technically better and maybe have a more engaging story now that everybody's back together off rip. They can introduce a whole bunch of new people. They'll probably have Spider-Man integrated there. I doubt it's going to be Insomniac Spider-Man. So unfortunately, we're going to probably get some weirdo looking Peter, but that's fine.
Yeah, I'm very curious because we're getting Spider-Man on PlayStation consoles, but he's just gonna be a character. He's not getting, because apparently they're saying Black Panther's gonna get like a small mission chain or whatever they call it.
So is Hawkeye, I think.
And Hawkeye's gonna be in the game, and then his daughter's getting a mission.
Yes, you're right.
A mission chain. Again, I don't know what that looks like until that's here. My only thing is in Insomniac's Spider-Man, when you find the Avengers Tower, he talks about how the Avengers are on the West Coast or something like that, or they're either something about the West Coast Avengers. So I'm wondering, and this is obviously taking place on the over there. So I'm wondering if there's gonna be connection, or if they're like just gonna pull out and leave Insomniac Spider-Man alone.
Yeah, that would be weird because I used to read a lot of West Coast Avengers, and they have their literal own set of people. So if they're gonna repurpose like the regular Avengers and make them the Avengers West Coast, that'd be weird.
Yeah.
But again, yeah, the fact that it's kind of like because only I think PlayStation is getting Spider-Man, right?
Only the PlayStation console, so PS4 and PS5 are gonna get Spider-Man as a character.
So I wonder, is this the opportunity to use Insomniac Spider-Man? It's already a PlayStation exclusive, so it's not like an Insomniac property is going to make an appearance on an Xbox console. So, I mean, I think it would be a massive misstep to not utilize that Spider-Man at least. If they were super smart, they'd put Miles in there, but that's just my preference.
Yeah, I wish. Well, I guess we'll have to see. I mean, it'll all say really as soon as we see a leaked picture of what suit he's wearing. If he doesn't have the white spider, which is Insomniac's thing right now, it's obviously not going to be the same spider. And it is a misstep if you're not. It'd be cool to start trying to create your own mini universe, because then you're starting to talk to them. Maybe one day we get our own Iron Man game that's not Iron Man VR and stuff like that don't rely. And if let's say every couple years we get another Avengers game, it'd be cool to see that constant thing. But we'll see what they decide to do with that.
Yeah, are you trying to say that Iron Man VR is not Game of the Year? Yeah, you watch your mouth.
Yeah.
But that's our Avengers Spoilercast, and sorry for you guys who maybe like this game. We didn't love it so much, but
yeah.
Hey, we gotta keep it honest.
We didn't absolutely hate it. We just know they're capable of more, and it's like in this hopeful a sequel where you're starting to get galactic, because again, the small clip is that lady who I already forgot her name, MODOK's Monica. She's quote unquote killed, and then she's brought back very quickly. Which again, come on, but she's still around, and she's gonna try to bring AIM back to the thing. The Kree Sentinel shoots off a signal up, which I'm assuming is gonna let people know, and so you're starting. They're starting to. They try to open it up very quickly at the end, but it's like you gotta fix the base stuff before you try to get even bigger in the Avengers. So it's interesting.
Yeah, so RIP to all of us that spent $60 on this game. Sorry about that. Hopefully, if you're someone who really likes online games and really plans on sticking to this, you could probably get your money's worth it out of it for you guys. But me and Steve have burned our money, so that's it for us.
Yeah, I'm not really into just getting... Because really the only thing to do after you beat the game is just get cosmetics.
Do more missions, yeah, which I find really boring. So,
which, yeah, are very boring. A lot of the cosmetics look the same. It's like, oh, here's another red and yellow Iron Man. And there's some elites and legendaries and stuff, but it's like, I don't want it. It doesn't do anything to me to get another Thor. Oh, wow, they look... Because none of the suits look that different, to be honest.
Yeah, well... Keep an eye out on our channel, and maybe we'll talk about Avengers more if a story breaks about them, and maybe they fix the game at some point. But we'll see. But yeah, for you guys, we're gonna have more spoiler casts for you guys as new games come out. Most likely, I think the next one will probably be Miles Morales. Most likely.
I believe so. Yep.
So keep an eye out for that. We don't have a ton of spoiler casts, but when we do them, it's really, really fun. And just keep in mind that every single week we have the Neo Vintage podcast going live every single Monday, where we break up the biggest stories in gaming. So keep your eyes out for that. And I'm Jabril, and I'm with
Steve. Hope you guys enjoyed.
And we'll see you guys next time. Bye.